Welcome back. Today we'll be learning about classes. This may be the most important video in the entire series. Classes are the backbone of a HaxeFlixel game and are crucial to understand if you want to use HaxeFlixel effectively. Everything that you've been learning so far has been leading up to this video. So to start off, we're going to make a new file. It's going to be a new Haxe file called enemy.hx. In Haxe, you normally put new classes in a new file. You don't normally have two different classes in the same file. At the top right package, the meaning of package in Haxe is a bit out of scope for this series. I'm going to write it down, but you don't have to. And now we'll create our class. We're going to write class enemy. Now, inside a class, you can add variables. I'm just going to create a variable called health. And we'll set it to 10. So this is exactly the same as any other variable. It's just inside a class. Although in some cases you might see this being called a class field. Now we'll write something called a constructor. So public function new. Every constructor has the name new, by the way. You can't name this anything else. And it works exactly like a function does. And inside here we'll just trace health. Now I'm going to put this tab next to the other tab so that I can see both files at the same time. This will make things easier to understand. Now we will make an instance of this class. To create an instance, you store it in a variable. So we need a variable called enemy, and we'll equal that to new, and then the name of the class, followed by brackets and a semicolon. This creates a new instance of a class. There are two important concepts here. There's the class, and there's also the instance of the class that we just created. These are not the same thing. The class can be seen as a blueprint. It can be seen as a place to put all of the information that a class instance needs. So in this case, we're defining an enemy with a variable called health. And so this enemy instance over here will have a variable called health. The important difference between these two, I'll just add this here really quick. Don't worry about this just yet. I'm going to explain that later. I just need to put that there in order for this to work. But to explain instances, the enemy has health. And we can set that to 20, for example. The cool thing about instances is that you can have multiple instances, and they can all have different values for the variables that you define in the class. So you can make a new enemy called enemy2, use new enemy. You can set the enemy to, if I could type, enemy2 health is equal to 50. Now when you trace enemy health and trace enemy to health and run that, and now you can see 20 and 50 in the console. This just shows you how to create two different class instances, and you can have different values for each class instance. To tie back to that blueprint analogy, the class is like a blueprint which has information on the blueprint that is used to construct new objects or instances out of that class information. But I'm just going to remove those traces, and I'm going to focus on this trace over here in the enemy constructor. You get two print statements that say 10. This is happening because when you create a new class instance, when you call new enemy, it will call the constructor function. So whenever you call this, it will then go through this code and trace health. And then it will store the new instance of enemy in this variable. So in the process of constructing this class instance of enemy, you also trace health. This is very useful if you want to set up the enemy instance to have certain values or run certain behavior when the enemy is first created. But every single time the constructor is 1, which is twice here, it will trace the default health value, which is 10. And you don't see 20 or 50 here because these health values are being set after the enemy is already constructed. If you wanted to display 20 or 50 instead of 10, you could change the value, or you could go into this code and set health to a different value. before tracing it. And now if you run that, you get 20 instead of 10. And one more thing about constructors before we move on. If you remove the constructor completely and just give it a variable and try to run that code, you will get an error. It says enemy does not have a constructor. If you create any instance of a class and it does not have a constructor, you will get a compile error. Even if you have an empty constructor that looks like this, that will be enough to allow your code to run. So to summarize all that, we created an enemy class inside another file. We created a new class instance using the constructor function, and then give each class instance their own values. Now, on top of variables and constructors, you can also add functions to a class. So I'm going to add a function called die, because enemies die usually. And it just says, oh no, I'm dead. Again, I'll add this little public thing. I'll get to that in a moment. And if you type in enemy.die, you can call that function. And now the enemy complains that it's dead. Like how variables can sometimes be called class fields, functions can sometimes be called class methods. I don't like that these have extra names, but they exist. So it's worth pointing out that variables in a class can be called fields, and functions in a class can be called methods. Now, as you might have already guessed, I'm using the dot operator to call functions and get variables from the enemy. So if I just trace health, you can set the enemy's health by doing .health, because the enemy has a health variable. So that's all that's doing. You're getting this enemy instance and using the dot operator to access the health variable on that enemy instance. And you're setting that to 20. And likewise with the function, we're getting the enemy instance, this specific enemy instance, and calling die on that instance using the dot operator. That is how you access variables and functions on a class. And of course you can read values from a variable using the dot operator in the same way. Now let's explain this public thing. If I remove public from function die and also from the health variable and run the code, we get errors. The compiler is saying it cannot access the private variable health. This is referring to line 12, which is this one right here. What it's saying is it's accessing the enemy instance and it's trying to access the health variable, but it can't because it is private. The main difference between private and public is that you can only access private variables and functions inside the class that it is defined in. So for example, that health value is currently private and die is currently private, but we can still use them here without any issues. That will not cause errors. And I will just compile that just to make sure, just to prove my point. And then we have two enemies that are dying immediately. So this works fine because it's private. But as soon as you add public to a variable or to a function, you can access these variables and functions outside of that class. Over here in the playstate class, we can access these just fine, as we saw before. Now you can actually type in private, but I feel like this is a bit pointless because variables are private by default when you create them in a class. So this is a private variable, and this is also a private variable. There's no difference here. With all of that in mind, you can sort of understand where create and update come from. Create and update are public functions of class playstate. There's a couple other things here, namely extends, override, and super, that we'll get to in the next video. But things are starting to come together. And I hope now that you can see how important classes are to HaxeFlixel. The concept of classes and inheritance, which again we'll cover next video, are crucial to understanding how HaxeFlixel works, because HaxeFlixel itself is built upon lots of different classes that are inherited with inheritance. And so hopefully next video, everything will make sense. So now I have a challenge. Just put the challenge text in here. Again, there's no code here. This is just a comment, a big old note. Your challenge is to create a new person class. Put it in a new file. You give it the variables name and age. Which values they are is up to you. And then you give it a greet function that prints out the name and age using trace. Now, there are multiple solutions to this. You could be using public and then calling greets on a class instance that already exists, or you can call greet from within the constructor of the person class. It's up to you how you want to solve this challenge, but there are multiple answers, and I will put 2 of those possible answers in the comments below. So good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.